Hi, I'm Ashanti. Welcome to my panel. Um, okay, great. Welcome to my panel. Um, I go by Dakota City Rag online, and today I want to talk to you about jam sessions, a little bit about what they are, why they're important, and how different musical communities approach them. Personally, this is something that's very important to me. I've been jamming for a little bit, but when I started out, it was very hard to understand. It's just something that has its own rules and social contexts that are not explained in a lot of places. And so I'm truly trying to make the resource that would have helped me several years ago. A lot of people who do jams, they just do it. They just figure out that initial hump, but that initial hump also stops a lot of people. So just want to, make it easier where we can. These are pictures of me and the various musical things I've done throughout the years. I've got a picture in the top left of me at a jazz jam. Clockwise from there, I also staff MacBest Jam Clinic every year. I've also been to hip hop ciphers in the bottom right. Below center is me at a Mexican folk jam session, and the bottom left is me and my band, Strangers That Click, and a lot of our music is written via jams. By day, I am a grant writer, which involves making a lot of strong logical arguments about why nonprofits deserve to be funded. But I'm not going to be doing as much of that today because a lot of what I want to present to y'all is not about strong arguments for why this thing should or shouldn't be this or that, but rather just presenting you with different approaches and options that you can approach in your own music making or that you can recognize in other people. This is also a map of the DC, Maryland, Virginia metro system, which is where I am, and it's where a lot of what I am about to teach you I learned, because this is where my musical community resides. What is a jam? I'm going to play a snippet of a jam that I think really captures what the spirit of it is, and leave this quote up here. But if you'll give me a moment. So it goes on like that for a bit, but that was a cover of Amory's One Thing by a local band here in DC, the Trifling Tuesdays band. And in that musical example, I really wanted to show off, first of all, it's a cover, and covers are a big part of the language of jam sessions, but also if you watch, you can see the way they physically communicate with one another. The singer points to the guitarist, and the guitarist starts soloing, but if you listen even more closely than that, you can also hear the way that what each of them are playing responds to one another. The guitarist is playing similar riffs to what the singer is playing. So yeah, as you can see with the quote, a jam session is a type of music making activity in which musicians come together and make music as they perform it, otherwise known as improv. And what I really want to focus on today is open jam sessions, where people who don't know each other come together and figure out how to make music together. It's one thing when you already have people who know each other well and know how to speak to one another. Truly anything can happen. But it's when you have strangers come together, there's like a special set of rules that people follow in order to make music together and have things flow a certain way. And as we'll see, different communities have different approaches to how they incorporate strangers into the mix. So one thing I want to demonstrate is the difference between different types of music making. One thing I will not be talking about today is presentational performance. As you can see from these quotes from Music at Social Life by Thomas Torino, presentational performance is what you might see at a concert. I have a picture here of these animatronic bears, which is like peak presentational performance, because there are no musicians in that live setting. They're just animatronic bears creating things for the audience to listen to. Whereas on top, I have a picture of VGM Con's Jam Space, which is very much about participatory performance. It is about getting everybody in the room to have a part of the music making process. And I think we can have all live music. We can kind of all live musical events can kind of be accounted for as being on a spectrum between these two things, and we'll definitely see the different types of jam sessions we discuss are more presentational or more participatory, or participatory for some of the people and presentational for others. And there are different people call jam sessions different things. I'll also be talking about hip-hop ciphers, which can also be spelled different ways depending on where you are. There are also song swaps in drum circles, and other names that I'm probably not aware of, but it's all, everything is related in this idea of it's people coming together to make music communally. So by contrast, I do want to talk a little bit about what is not a jam. Here is Tony Blackman explaining what is not a hip-hop cipher.
If a community of artists, a gathering of artists, and they're not listening to each other, it's not a cipher. If they're not looking at each other, it's not a cipher. If they're just taking turns going, and there's no exchanging of information or ideas, technically it's not a cipher. So the word is being used to describe these gatherings, which I think is very beautiful. But I do like to point out that that's not a cipher. And that's why I proselytize a cipher all the time.
So that really gets to the heart of what I want to talk about today. I do not want to be down on other types of performances like a classical music concert where everybody's sitting quietly in a hall listening to people perform things that they've studied, practicing the exact same way they're going to perform it, or even like a pop music concert where you have, you're here to see Beyonce. You're not here to listen to the audience sing along with Beyonce. Those are very cool, but they're just outside the scope of the presentation. And as you'll see, I have these pictures of, this is my college jazz band, which is very much not a jam because we were reading sheet music and we were playing it the same every time. And even though in that jazz band there were people who were improvising, especially the comping instruments or the featured soloists, for most of us, most of the time, it was more presentational, especially because when we had other people come into the space, they were there to listen and not to participate. But like I said, everything is kind of on a spectrum. So even having those comping instruments who are improvising and having those featured soloists, there's a little bit of participatory music making in that. This is another band that I was in. Below that, this is a cover band I was in. Great, lots of fun. A little bit participatory because it was music made for dancing and we encouraged people to dance and sing along. That's why we did cover songs. But mostly it was presentational because we're not involving other people in the music making process. We're playing the same songs the same way every time and aren't really changing up how we play in response to whatever else is going on. So why are jams important? Basically, not reading this whole block of text, but I do think it's important. Jams are rituals in the same way that I have pictures of my graduation and a funeral I went to. Rituals are a way of people like articulating what is important to us and how we think relationships should be. So like, I think a graduation from school is a great example, because what is a graduation really? You read a lot of books and you listen to some people talk for a while and then you leave with a piece of paper and a fancy hat. We have a graduation ceremony because we are imbuing those book readings and those lectures with meaning. You are not just, when you put on the hat and you turn it to the side, you're not just saying, I read a lot of books. You're taking on an identity of somebody who has a degree. And same thing with funerals. You're not just having somebody whose organ stopped working and putting them in the ground. You are taking that opportunity to reflect on what your relationship was to that person and the community around you, and that's why we have all these rituals around them. Everything from the music that is played at funerals to the way the sermons and pastors give sermons in churches at funerals, and even the whole ceremony of putting them in a casket and mourning together. And so similarly with jam sessions, it's not just the way we do music, it's not just the act of making music together. The way we do that music making reflects the relationships between the musicians and how they are and how the musicians want them to be. And that is definitely something I'm going to be talking about as I compare and contrast the different types of jam sessions, how they reflect different ideals of relationships and communities. That's why I also wanted to show these two pictures of these two different jazz movies. These are very different visions of what jazz music and jazz relationships are like. If you've seen Whiplash, it is a very there's a lot of anxiety in their jazz music. Their jazz music is very much about playing things perfectly, playing things according to how the leader, J.K. Simmons, wants it to be played, and playing it precisely, being perfect, aiming for perfection. And comparing that with Disney and Pixar's Soul, there is an element of the characters in that movie want Joe to be better. There is an element of like exclusionary, like they look down on him before they realize how he can play. But once he's accepted into the community, it is no longer about trying to be perfect. It is just about how they relate to each other. So as Christopher Small says in his book, Musicking, the relationships that are created in a musical performance are both the relationships between the sounds we hear, but also the way that those sounds relate to the relationships, and the relationships relate to the people making those relationships in ways that are very hard to articulate verbally, but make perfect sense when you hear the music. And that's what I will be trying to explain today. So I want to give it to Tony Blackman here to talk a little bit more about like what we learn about at jam sessions and why they're important.
So we learn many things. We learn how to listen to one another. We learn how to share space, literally and creatively share space, meaning we might be taking turns on this one exercise, but if she is in a zone, that means we fall back and let her empty out and pour out what's in her spirit and in her heart. We learn how to build on the ideas put forth by others. That means that I may be a blank slate today, but I bet walks in and he's on fire. And so the topics that he's spitting about then inspire me to also catch a bit of the heat from him. We learn to trust. We learn to trust ourselves, and that it's okay to make mistakes in front of other people. And when we do that, we then learn to better trust others. And that is how the collaboration improves.
All right, so she basically said so much better than I could have, so I'm going to move on. But that is really what I want to get at here. It's just different types of music making relate to different types of relationships that we have with other people. Like music is relationships, not just with the sounds, but also with others. And there's a whole lot to be said about the kinds of relationships that are had and that are reinforced in presentational musics that I'm not going to be talking about today. So let's get into the types of jam sessions. First, I want to get into jazz. I feel like jazz is what a lot of people think of when they think of jam sessions. And for those of you who've been to MagFest Jam Clinic or VGM Con's Jam Space, I feel like that is closest. What we do there, I would not call it jazz jam session or in that style. It's very different in a lot of ways, but it is closest to jazz of the four examples I'm going to be talking about today. So that's why I want to start there. So at a jazz jam, people play specific tunes that most of the community members know how to play. These are called standards. Standards themselves are often jazz covers of older songs, especially like when jazz was the popular music of the day in the earlier 20th century. People were just taking songs they liked, especially from Broadway musicals, and turning those into the jazz songs they wanted to play. They just covered it, and they're like, okay, how do I make this more like what I like? And that really forms the foundation of how jazz musicians communicate, is taking songs that are established and building new stuff on top. As you can see in these pictures, I have an example of like a simple traditional blues form, which is just 1, 4, and 5 chords, and an example of how a jazz musician might spice it up by adding extra harmonies, 2, 5, 1 chords, etc. And so that basic idea of taking a familiar song and just doing what you want with it, and having a shared language with your community of songs that you all like to play together, is foundational to jazz. I do have a picture of the real book. We will definitely get into the controversy around the real book, but I think it's important to let. For all the real book's faults, that is a great first look of the kinds of music that is played at jazz jam sessions. You know, the list of songs in that book are things that jazz musicians often like to play. So the way that these songs are structured is they will play the song as you know it, the main melody, and the lyrics, you know, if there's a singer, or if there's not a singer, the instrumentals will just play the notes that a singer would sing. And then you have a solo, which is when they improvise over the same chord changes in same amount of time that you would have as the head, which is the main melody, and then people do the head, and then that's the end of the head again, and then the end of the song. So head, solo, head. In jazz jams, solos are ordered by instrument. So there's a vocalist, they'll go first. Horn players go, and then you have the comping instruments like piano and guitar. If there's a bass solo, then they'll go, and then drums are usually last, and then it's the head. There's also a thing called trading fours, where as you go through the song, 4 measures of drum improv and then 4 measures of another instrument, and we can trade across the band or with a drummer and one particular person. So in this blues example, you would still follow the form. So you would have the drummer improvise over these first 4 chords, or in this space, because there wouldn't be any chords playing. And then you would have everybody play as normal for this F chord, 2 bars of that, and the C chord for 2 bars of that. And then you would have the drummer improvise over these last 4 bars. And then you would have somebody improvise over the C, these 4 bars of C, and you keep repeating that pattern until you get to a place where you want to resume the head and end the song. Because of this structure, most heads are short. They're under a minute, especially for blues songs. I mean, you see how many measures this is. You can imagine it does not take a particularly fast tempo to go through this relatively quickly. In fact, for like blues songs, a lot of the heads are played twice. In my experience, most jazz jams are built around instrumentalists. It's mostly instrumentalists who come. Vocalists are definitely welcome, but they are expected to take a leadership role when they arrive, especially because of the way that songs have to be built to fit their range. Most songs are played in a particular key, unless you have a vocalist who will often say, hey, I need to play this like I need to play this in B instead of D flat because it fits their range better. And so they really have to take a leadership role to make the songs work with them. There are a lot of blues ideas in jazz, but there's like a lot of people use the blues form, people use blues language, but as we'll see, it does not often sound like blues music. There's a lot of important distinctions. So getting into the relationship that are built at jazz jams, it is often participatory for artists, not the audience. As we'll see later, there are some jam sessions where truly everybody who is present in the room is a part of the music making. In jazz jams, that is not the case. Anybody is welcome to come up on stage, but there is still a clear distinction between these are the artists and this is the audience. And I even mentioned the word stage. Some jam sessions don't have stages. Jazz jams do, or at least a section of the room that functions as a stage, just creating a physical barrier between these are the music makers and these are the listeners, these are the audience. Jazz jams have a huge emphasis on mastery and study. It is an oral tradition, but it is one where people expect to learn by listening to recordings of jazz masters or studying with jazz masters. I mean, jazz music is an academic curriculum at many schools, and that definitely plays into this idea that jazz is it's not something you just do, it's something that you dedicate yourself to. It's something worthy of serious consideration and serious effort and serious time. And part of that culture of mastery and study is people are often discouraged from playing songs that they don't know or are not familiar with. There are definitely jazz jam sessions where people do use sheet music, but at a lot of jam sessions, it is more often discouraged. And that's why I had the picture of the real book and also this picture that I found on Google Images. It's just like, don't use real books, from an article saying it's time to get rid of your real book. That's a whole thing in jazz culture is the real book, and the way that a lot of jazz people have a story where they started with the real book because it's a great book with a lot of different tunes you can learn, and then they slowly learned to stop using it because of that emphasis on learning by ear and learning from jazz masters, and learning from the source is a thing that a lot of people say. Complexity and technical achievements are valued and celebrated at jazz jams, and part of that ties back into what I was saying about changing songs to make them more like you like. A lot of that is adding harmonies that are more complicated, not just for the sake of being complicated. Like, people also like things that sound good to them, not just complication for complication's sake, but it is a place where that complexity is valued in a way that, as we'll see with other jams, people don't need the added complexity. They can appreciate things being simple or even more accessible. Another part of that emphasis on mastery and study is, in my experience, when people talk about famous jazz musicians, they talk about them in terms of their musical career. They talk about how I've heard stories about like John Coltrane spending 16 hours a day practicing the fundamentals of his instrument, or the kind of relationships that Charlie Parker had with Miles Davis, or that story from Whiplash about Charlie Parker in the beginning of his career not being good enough and being discouraged by other jazz musicians. As we'll see as we compare with other jam sessions, other communities describe their musical heroes in different ways, not necessarily how good they were at music or the relationships with other musicians, but people who are non-musicians. Part of what you hear is at jazz. Part of what you'll hear at jazz jams is also uninterrupted solos. As people improvise at a jazz jam, it is expected that you are listening. This is not a place where people where the audience like really responds in the same as they would in other jams. They're not really encouraged to sing along in the same way. It is a place to pay attention to what's going on. And then the last thing is how long choruses or how long solos take. Usually one solo, your solo should take up one chorus. If it's a particularly quick song, it should be two. If it's a long, slow song, then you can trade phrases with another band member so that you each take up one solo or one chorus. But basically each chorus has to be like exponentially more impressive than the last to justify itself. And this is not something that people will say directly, but it is something that you will notice very quickly as people, they're feeling a solo at the beginning, and then they go on for another chorus, and it's like, okay, this was cool, but not cool enough that you need to keep doing it. And people, it's a place where people want to participate with each other, and everybody needs their turn. But in balancing that with the emphasis on mastery and study, if you are really amazing, then you can get away with doing another chorus, but it's usually just better to just let somebody else have their turn. To incorporate VGM at jazz jams, some things I would suggest is the most important thing for any jam session is you want tunes that other people know, that other people will be able to play with. And in some ways that is kind of that is not going to be helpful trying to incorporate VGM at jazz jams, because these musical communities are built around the shared vocabulary and understanding of tunes. And if you are bringing in a tune that is out that people don't know, then it is going to be harder. That being said, there are some VGM tunes that have more in common with jazz repertoire that might be helpful in getting people more used to it or being able to pick up on it more easily. A lot of jazz tunes are very melody driven. The whole solo head structure really requires that, so you can identify, okay, this is the head where they're playing the melody I know, and this is where they're soloing and not doing that. Like I mentioned, heads are short, so generally around 30 seconds for a short one or 2 minutes for a super long one. And the head structure also requires that these songs be able to be looped. You can take the chord progression and just do it over and over again. I say that 2 to the power of n measures, but basically that means songs come in 32 bar loops is a very common one. I know 12 is not 2 to the n, but 2 is a very important number in musical form, so we don't have to get into why or the depths of that. But odd-numbered forms are going to be more challenging because people expect to hear 2 to the power of n when they're listening. It's a very subconscious thing. Again, things that tie into the jazz repertoire, if you have a song that fits the AABA or 12-bar blues form, like Rosalina and the Observatory from Super Mario Galaxy's AABA, as well as the Athletic Theme from Yoshi's Island. Those are forms that jazz people are very familiar with, and they can pick up very subconsciously and very easily. And of course, 12-bar blues, like everybody can play that. And if you have a 12-bar blues tune like the Ice Climbers theme, you could probably get away with just walking into it. It would be easy to get away with that because everybody who doesn't know the melody knows how to play that form, and then you can play the melody yourself, and then everybody knows how to solo over that form. Also songs with clear harmonic functions or patterns, especially because that will allow people to add that extra spice that jazz musicians love. I have a picture of the Tetris theme up here that's just 1s and 5s. At a jazz jam, you might not just play those 1s and 5s, you might add some 2s or some other things to lead into those chords, but a jazz musician would know what to do with that if you have a song that's just built on 1s and 5s. Also, songs that already have a bunch of 2/5s, because that is a very common chord progression in jazz that jazz people know what to do with. They know how to play over that. So like Lost Woods, that is a 2-5-2-5-1-6 progression that is very common in jazz, and a jazz person knows how that sounds. They know how to solo over it. They know how to play it without being taught. And other tunes that are built on circle of fourths, like Aquatic Ruin Zone from Sonic 2, very similar to a lot of jazz songs like Autumn Leaves. So more examples. Yeah, basically just went over these similar things, but the big thing that all of these tunes have in common is that they are widely covered, because by far the most important thing, and should I play this song at a jam session, is do other people know it? So do other people know how to play it? So all of these other things are secondary to try to help you figure out what songs people might be able to know, or what songs might they be able to learn more quickly. But the most important thing is, can I play this with people? The next type of jam I want to get into is the acoustic blues session, which is distinct from the electric blues session. I do want to show you a video of what that can be like. This is technically not a formal acoustic blues jam session that I attended. I was at a music festival and it started raining, and so we all ran for cover near the nearest awning, and then there were bluegrass musicians there who just started playing. So this is a great example of what that sounds like. So I really love that video in that moment, because it really just shows like how musical communities operate. Like, these are people who just came together and, not really have a plan to be doing things like that. I think a lot of these musicians were already in the area as part of the festival, but this specific jam session was not planned. This is just something we did because it was raining, and then we all gathered. As you can see, they're kind of, well, you might be able to see, they're in a circle. They're all facing each other. And they are playing, if you can hear the chord progressions, they're simple. They're more like 1s, 4s, and 5s, and it's very song-driven. So yeah, as you go to a blues jam session, you will hear very song-driven tunes. Singing is more communal and more accessible. I mentioned there are singers at jazz jams, but they're the way a lot of jazz jams are built around that emphasis on mastery and study. Singers are there to feature how well they can sing the song, in a way that blues jam sessions are more about, what can we sing together? So the melodies might be less impressive or less difficult, but it's something that people are expected to sing along in. Call and response is a big thing in a lot of the blues. Especially with very patternistic lyrics, so that you can keep calling and keep responding with new variations. Like I mentioned, songs are mostly made up of 1, 4, and 5 chords. There's a lot of guitars and a lot of string instruments, which I think especially ties into explaining why guitars are so important in the blues is beyond the scope of this presentation, but I would guess that it has a lot to do with the portability of the instrument, and also the way you can create harmonies and sing along. Piano's almost got that, but it's hard to carry your piano around everywhere. Saxophones are cool, can't exactly sing around, can't create entire chords very well. There's less equal temperament. I'm not going to get into the specific tuning in this, but what you'll hear is a lot of flat thirds and flat sevenths and blue notes, things that you won't find at a piano. That you can easily, however, create with stringed instruments or voice or wind instruments. I mentioned this is an acoustic blues session. Electric blues sessions are a different type of jam. There are some similarities, but I ultimately won't be focusing on them. But part of the acoustic blues genre is that there is no amplification. And part of that allows people to be heard more easily. There's quieter instruments. It's not blasting through speakers. And the keys of most of the songs are in C, E, A, D, or G, as Adam Neely explains.
You can kind of see how the instrument governs how you might think about the harmony, what you find important in the harmony. And guitarists love thinking C, G, D, A, E. They are the guitar chord.
So getting into the kinds of relationships that people have at blues jams. Blues music has often been considered like the people's music, especially as juxtaposed with jazz music, which is more considered the musician's music. And then you can kind of see how the level of complexity that is encouraged and valued at jazz jams is contrasted with what you might find at blues jams. Blues jams are more about bringing people together. As you saw at the bluegrass jam, and is also my experience at acoustic blues sessions, people perform in a circle. There is no distinction between the artists and the audience. Even if you aren't singing or playing an instrument, you are still part of the same community as the people who are. It is all one thing. When people sing the heads, there is still a head solo head structure, but they sing them together. And in my experience, a lot of people are seated. There's less of a pretense of a performance. It is also an oral tradition like jazz, but unlike jazz jam sessions, people are more willing to learn and teach songs on the spot. In jazz jam sessions, in my experience, it's more, you can learn. If you don't know a song, you don't have to play on this song. You can go home and study it and then come back and we'll try again. At a blues session, people are more willing, like, okay, let me just sing you this song, and they're often because they're built on simpler chords and repetitive lyrics, they're easier to learn and pick up on, especially with the call and response structure. And again, contrasting with the jazz musicians I talked about, like Charlie Parker and John Coltrane, in my experience, people talk about their blues heroes and other blues legends in terms of their day jobs. Archie Edwards, the namesake of the Archie Edwards Blues Heritage Foundation here in DC, was a barber, and he ran blues jam sessions out of his barbershop. And people talk about him not only in terms of his amazing playing, but also in terms of the kind of community member he was and how he cultivated this community around the barbershop in a way that there are lots of jazz musicians who have had jobs outside of music, but in my experience, those are not the things that people talk about as often or focus on, because that is not part of the mythology and the cultural values of how people perceive these musicians. Again, how can you incorporate video game music at acoustic blues jams? This is a little easier than the jazz jam. It's easier in certain ways. It's easier because there's already an established tradition of it is okay to teach people songs on the spot. So that creates an opening for, okay, this is not part of the established blues repertoire, but we can still learn it. It's also harder because blues songs sound like there's less overlap between how VGM sounds and how blues sounds, so it'll be a little bit harder to find songs that fit within that. You would want to be looking for things that are basically easy to teach and learn via sing-along. So repetitive patternistic structures, not a ton of chords, and if they have a call and response, even better, and are very diatonic. There are a couple of 12-bar blues songs in VGM. The Ice Climber theme is actually not one I would recommend at an acoustic blues jam because the melody is very complicated, and that would be more suited for a jazz jam. By contrast, if you've heard Alligator Blues and the song Later Alligators, that is perfect. It's a 12-bar blues. It's built on a call and response. It has very patternistic lyrics. Every chorus is about the way the alligator's life sucks. So, if you're learning that, if you're doing that song at a blues jam, it's easy to freestyle over in that theme. You can also do harmonically simplified versions of your faves. Like I said, a lot of jazz musicians take blues songs or other songs and spice them up with advanced harmony, and you can also do that in reverse. I have Super Mario Odyssey here, for example, and if you were to take that to a blues jam, I would recommend taking out some of these extra chords and just stay on the C chord for a little bit, stay on the F chord for a little bit, go back to the C chord, and then end with a G chord. You don't need to do the turnarounds or the extra 2-5-1s. Just keep it simple, and also you can keep it slower. You don't need this fancy intro. And then you could just loop that. Die House from Cuphead is also a great one. It's built on E, G, and B and has a call and response section. It's like, don't mess with King Dice, don't mess with me. You could have people sing that. And also Cruel World from Red Dead Redemption is literally just an 8-bar blues written by Willie Nelson. The hip hop cipher, or Cipher. I'm going to mute and show you a quick video of what these environments are like.
my thing, and like a royal rumble, the right, jab, an uppercut. You know how I do it, and I do it also rough and up. If anybody in the mic in the house tonight wanna come in today, let's step on
Where my vocalists and poets and MCs? Where my vocalists and poets who wanna rock with me? Where my vocalists and poets?
So as you can hear, obviously rapping is a central feature of hip-hop cipher music. There is, in this particular cipher, there's a live band. Sometimes there's the music that people rap over is provided by computers. But the most important thing is I hope you're able to see the way people are responding to each other. It's a short video, but you have the person who's rapping when the video starts, and then you can kind of hear somebody adding an additional layer of singing underneath that. And then as they are ready to hand off the mic, they talk about, other people in the room, and then you have the secondary person pick up off of them. Where are my vocalists and poets and MCs? And then after that, somebody else is going to walk up and take the mic. And it's really central to this, as with all jams, is the way that people's energy feeds off of each other. The point of jams is the way we respond to each other and relate to each other. And the way hip-hop ciphers do that is different than jazz and blues, but it is all part of what Tony Blackman mentioned earlier. It's the way we respond to one another. In my experience, it is built, because it's built off of rappers and vocalists, other musicians are welcome, but it's not necessarily built around them. And myself as a saxophonist, in my experience, I have to take my leadership in my own role and figure out where I fit in the way, as opposed to like a jazz jam session, there's a defined role for me to be there. I'm playing the head, and then I'm soloing, and then I'm laying out. Whereas with hip hop cipher, it's my job. I can figure out how to add to what's going on and not distract. As opposed to jazz jams and blues jams, repertoire and playing like covers of songs are much less relevant. They're not completely irrelevant, but it is much more in the way that jazz jams and blues jams are really built on taking songs you already know and building something new on top. Hip-hop ciphers are much more often you can just build the thing itself. And there's much less focus on like, okay, let's play a melody we already know and then build something new based off of that melody. You can just have a beat and then you can rap over that. In my experience, the way people structure the music is really about maintaining and controlling the energy in the room. That is how they structure. Solos are structured. In other genres, people might talk about like building a narrative and building a story, and that is also very important in hip hop, even more so because there's lyrics you're freestyling with. But it's also getting not just getting the crowd hyped, but knowing when to not be hyped so that you can get them hyped later. Other minor things, swung 16th notes are much more popular than swung 8th notes as they would be in blues and jazz. And beatboxing is also a popular way to participate. In my experience, there's fewer defined endings with hip-hop music at ciphers. You can just have the beat go on for as long, or the beat for a particular song just go on for as long as people are vibing with it. In a way that you would not want that for a jazz song because people will get sick of it. But longer can actually be better in hip hop ciphers. This is a excerpt from an article that Ethan Hine wrote on his blog about his own experiences at a hip hop cipher. And in describing like the kinds of music that plays with his beat. Like this is something he transcribed that was the foundation of like an hour-long chunk of a hip-hop cipher, just these 4 beats. And it really shows the difference in that, you might have a jazz song that's 32 bars, a lot of different chords, and even that they don't want to go on too long. But in hip-hop, this 4-beat song at 140 BPM is something that can sustain a huge chunk of time because that beat, the loop in hip-hop, is the foundation of how people relate to each other and how they relate to the music. It's a steady presence that they can improv off of, as opposed to jazz, which is more about, you have different chords that create different colors that you can improvise off of. I want to show another clip of a hip-hop cipher that can all really get at like how people relate to each other. This is from MagFest 2020, a hip-hop cipher we had there. Give me one moment. So hopefully in that example, you got a sense of not only how the two featured rappers were playing off of each other. If you couldn't hear all the lyrics, you can definitely see in their body language that they're responding to each other. They're responding to each other's energy. And then after they're done, you have the theme that you recognize from Mario 64 as a way of like a vamp between rappers, not underneath them. It's not distract between them, but even the band, the horn section, is also responding to their energy. I hope you could hear like the woo of the crowd. Like that is also an integral part of ciphers. It's the way that everybody is responding to each other, whatever's going on, in a way that is, again, true for other types of sessions like the jazz jam session, but it expresses itself in a different way. You would not hear the audience loudly woo like that. You might hear them clap at the end of a solo, but they would not respond to the energy in the same way, even if, a jazz drummer and jazz pianist might respond to each other's dynamics and rhythms in a way similar to how these two rappers responded to each other. In my experience at Hip Hop Ciphers, there is still a distinct audience. The ciphers that I've been to, there is still like a seated area for people to sit in, but there's much less of a concrete barrier. Like people can flow more freely between the audience side and the stage, especially if you were in the audience and you're feeling inspired and now you want to take the mic. Like that is a more acceptable thing to do than it would be at a jazz jam session. Like people encourage you to come up and participate in jazz jams, but not during the song. If you already decided you don't want to play on this particular song, then you're out for that song. You can't just feel inspired and go up, in my experience. In contrasting different types of jams, like there's less discussions of music theory at hip hop ciphers, which to me has led to like not less support in terms of community, but again, as an instrumentalist, a saxophonist who playing notes and not using lyrics, I have to take more of a leadership role in figuring out how I fit in a way that contrasting jazz jam sessions, people are very familiar with the language of like, okay, this chord here, this key, etc., and you can play this then. So in my experience at a hip hop cipher, it is even more critical to use your ear. Obviously, using your ear is important in every type of music, but different types of music require different levels of using your ear and responding in the moment versus using more of your analytical brain and figuring things out beforehand. Rappers, all musics value a delicate balance between originality and respecting what came before. And rap is no exception, but I think that the way it shows up in rap is a little bit different than you might find in jazz. In jazz, you are expected to basically mimic what has come before you, and then once you have mastered that and really gotten a sense of why people do those things, then you can start doing your own thing. You're supposed to be transcribing solos and learning other people's tunes. And in rap, you are definitely encouraged to hit the ground running with your own material, just start freestyling. However, that does not mean it's unimportant to acknowledge and learn from tradition. And that is also a dynamic in the hip hop world in which there are some people who can hit the ground running freestyling and do not pay as much attention to the tradition. And it creates this dynamic in the hip hop world where what really sets people above as the greatest rappers are the ones who are both able to create their own sound while also respecting that tradition. We are getting close to time. So just a little bit about VGM and hip hop ciphers. Because covers are less of a thing, I would encourage not to worry about it as much. But try to create space for freestylings. Melodies can't be too dense. I think of it as like creating a fill-in-the-blank call and response. You definitely want to have 80 to 110 BPM. You want to have loops of like 2, 4, 8 bars, and should always be in duple meter or 6/8 or 12/8. No complex time signatures. I took a picture of my DAW here to show a little bit what I'm talking about. Like you have one section that is dense with horn sections and one section where it's empty, because a lot of the way I conceptualize participating in hip hop ciphers is just, you can remove layers. And because crate dinging and flipping samples is such an integral part of hip hop ciphers, it is both easier and harder to incorporate VGM in this style of music, because you can approach it as if you were a crate digger or sample artist and just like use whatever you want to create the backbeat of to create a beat for somebody to freestyle over. But that would make, on the flip side, an entire cover would be less appropriate. Definitely got to skim through this free-for-all. There's not really an established name for this type of jam, but what I mean by it is just jams where there's not an established genre or repertoire. And one thing you would have to do in this jam is leadership is very important, which not leadership by being bossy, but leadership by just, helping people understand, what we're doing when, because people are not necessarily on the same page with their genre expectations. You can communicate non-verbally during the music or verbally beforehand, who should we be focusing on when, who's going to solo, who's going to be the star, who's in a support role. And the music ends up being very groove-based because that's easy for people to lock into. It can also end up being loop-based because that's easy for people to lock into. And it's not a situation where you want to compose an entire complex song on the fly. You can pick 4 good chords and loop that. I have this great example of people fitting in, the tigers fitting in next to this statue, and that's really what you want to do in this type of music, is figure out how you can mimic others and fit in with what they're doing, because the expectations for people's skill backgrounds are so much more varied than others. Then it's really important to just be able to keep rhythm with other people, to be able to mimic what they're doing, and to be able to harmonize with them and be in tune with them, and to be able to respond to what they're doing. But sometimes these do congeal into specific songs. Don't really have as much time to go into the kinds of tunes you would do at a free-for-all, but it is actually less important because you don't want to force things. As I said, songs can come out, but just follow the flow. That being said, short, iconic melodies are great, and short, iconic chord progressions. Next thing, find jams in your area. Go on facebook.com/events, meetup.com. If you want a calendar of jams in the DC area, I'm happy to provide that with. I've been making my own. This is just like recurring jam sessions that I've been taking note of. And ask musicians where you can find where you can jam with them or find other jams. And what I really want y'all to take away from this is just not that all jams have to be a certain way, but just a set of questions y'all can ask yourselves when you find musical communities that can help you fit in and help you respect what's going on around you. How do the members of the community relate to one another? How are those relationships reflected in the music? And how can you participate in musically and socially? Be open, be observant, be some other O word. I wanted to try a joke about empathetic or understanding, or C, passionate, but bad, poorly done jokes is a great way to end a presentation. I've got references if y'all want to see. I'm happy to share the slide deck. Definitely want to acknowledge all these amazing people who helped make this presentation what it is, who taught me everything I know about jam sessions. I will definitely be taking questions on Discord if you have them. Thank you so much. Sorry for going over time. This was a lot of fun. I hope you learned something, and if you haven't jammed before, I hope this can help you get started. Thank you very much, everybody.